Skylands. On the road to the capital, which took 2 days to reach, there were 3 attempts to free them from their carts. The commander's men, as they were often called, all of which failed to Gerald's unsurprise. He wondered if anyone would be attempted, and he also hoped that one would work. But none were, and he knew that it would have been futile to try again, as it would have only resulted in more bloodshed. He'd have rather spared the men who attempted to rescue him before, but it was too late for that now, and besides he had bigger things to worry about now that they were here in the capital. He wondered, should Ruler Rigus decide to spare him, what would become of him? Was he not sparing him now by expediting him in a cart, while the other men walked, starved, died, and fell? Perhaps, however, he wished to make a demonstration out of Commander Luris and his men, a spectacle, and a warning to would-be traitors. Gerald would have gulped, would have had on him a look of fear, but he did not fear the man, though he had never face-to-face met him. He had heard rumors, but nonetheless he would face whatever fate the mother and the father had awaiting him. He prayed that his wife and his young daughter had fled. When they were in the heart of it, it was obvious that a large crowd had formed, a huge one, in fact, and Gerald knew what it was they were there awaiting. Surely, he thought, surely he was a dead man. As they opened the carts, commanded him to stand, it was some foot soldier of no significance, and then marched him out onto the square in front of Capital's palace, he realized that it was not he who was to be sentenced to death. In front of him stood Commander Luris, on his knees. They forced Gerald on his knees as well to watch the proceeding take place. The ruler, as he was often called, sword in hand, the crowd roaring, placed the edge of his blade across the commander's neck. Commander Luris himself did not move, and he did not yell or cry or beg. He simply stared forward, seemingly accepting his fate. When the ruler raised his sword and went to cast his swing, Commander Luris stood and knocked over the ruler, tackling him to the ground. His hands bound behind him, using his teeth, he bit off part of the ruler's cheek, the only part of the man's body he could reach in that short span of time before the ruler's guard grabbed hold of him. They placed the sword in his back, and yet before he died he spat the hunk of the ruler's cheek out onto the ground in front of him, where he then lay in the center of the square, his blood pooling a deep crimson pool. The ruler lay down squealing. His guard picked him up and moved him through the crowd back into the palace. The rest of them, Gerald and the important men who stood there, and the 2 who had pretended to be important men, they were taken back into their carts and carted away to various locations. The people of the capital hailed them with furious rocks, which for the most part simply bounced off of the cage, though a few smaller ones made it through. Gerald was not struck, but one of the other men, Leopold was, though he was not injured, only enraged. Many of the men were enraged. Gerald, along with Frosian, who sat next to him, stared off into the distance, thinking of nothing of any import, awaiting their fate, or perhaps awaiting, as Commander Luris had waited, for their opportunity to attack. It was not long before one of the 2 guards, the young ones who had faked their way to the cart, began to look at Gerald, and he asked, "Sir," he said, he had short reddish blonde hair, "Sir, do you know what they're going to do with us?" One of the guardsmen spat at him and told him to keep his mouth shut, but Gerald looked at him and shook his head. "I don't." "Oh," said the boy, as he was a boy. The other one, the one that he escaped with, if you could call what was happening to them a successful escape, looked down solemnly, obviously fearful. Still, Gerald thought that he'd seen much battle and survived. Perhaps they would survive this, though he did not know why he wanted that they live. After all, they probably did kill 2 of the guardsmen. Nonetheless, Gerald would keep an eye on them, and they seemed innocent enough, and he did not want them to see any more bloodshed, though he knew they would have to. Strangely, he understood what they had to do, and perhaps in their shoes he would have done something similar. The other carts, there were 3 or 4 of them, maybe. Gerald couldn't recall, as he did not heed them much attention, each carrying their respective cargo of important or semi-important individuals of the Legion, all of whom Gerald knew. Perhaps they would survive this, he thought, though surely he would yet die. As the carts continued, dragged by heavy horses, they each splintered and divided into separate locations down the streets of the capital. A place that would be quite beautiful if it weren't for its people, Gerald thought warily to himself, although perhaps not all of the people, yet despised he and his men. Maybe even there were some who sought to help them. Gerald thought these things despite his commander's death, despite what was happening to him. He remained hopeful, and he remained realistic at the same time. He knew that if he died, then his worries would be not, and again, if he made it out alive and they decided not to kill him, and he knew that his odds at least if survival would increase by quite a bit. Though he supposed he would be branded or some such marker would be cast upon him as was customary of slaves in the capital, and then perhaps he would not wish to be a survivor of such events. Still, yet he was a survivor, if nothing else. He was a soldier who'd lived through the battles of the Western lands, partly because he had left, and partly because he was a skilled warrior, as were all the men of the Legion. Even these two goons sitting next to him and across from him in the cart, the two who had replaced the commander's men, Gerald grinned at the thought, oddly, given the scenario, and some of the men looked at him oddly as he began to laugh. He laughed so hard he nearly bellowed, as Gerald was a hearty man, clever and jolly in mind, hard and stocky in body. As they looked at him, he could not help himself but to explain. "Brothers," he said as he realized it, "don't you see?" "See what?" Froshin asked under his breath, signaling Gerald to quiet himself, but Gerald would not. "They mean to sell us off as warriors and not as slaves." "What?" Froshin said harshly. "We will be slaves," Gerald clarified, calming himself, "but we will fight for the glory of capital. Of the capital." "And the arena?" asked the one boy who had spoken earlier. Gerald had grown quiet now, nodding to himself and glancing over at the boy. "Yes," he murmured. "Yes, we will fight there." "Gerald," said the boy next to him. "Good, we will have good," said the boy next to him. "Good, we will have a chance to win our freedom." Gerald shook his head, a tear streaming down his eye. You will all die there." "But you don't know that," said the other boy, the one with blonde and red hair. Gerald nodded. "I do." The remainder of the men grew quiet, and their fear was permeable. One of the men, Guthro, mumbled to himself, "I won't fight for some mass of people." "You'll have to," Gerald said, glancing over to him and then to his left and outside of the cage. "So will I." He took a deep breath in from his nostrils and out from his mouth, slowly and calmly. Some of the other men nodded in agreement. Others were yet fearful, but all of them were ready, or thought they were, for what was to come, whatever it may be. Gerald wondered, where was it they would plan to take him? Surely a fighter's school, or perhaps they would take them straight to the arena. After a spectacle such as that which was displayed in the square outside the palace, surely the masses would want more. Though the emperor had nearly been killed, Gerald smiled at the thought. So perhaps they would wait a day or two. "I wonder," he said, "will they take us to the arena, do you think, boys?" He attempted to lift their spirits, though perhaps it was not the time or place to do so, but he did not care. If he were perhaps to die, he would have a good laugh beforehand. Some of the men shook their heads at him, but the others smiled. Froshin had a sly grin on his face at last, which is what Gerald was accustomed to from him. The carriage drivers, with their reins in hand, shouted back at them angrily to quiet themselves, but Gerald shouted back, "Come back here and take us on, then." To that the carriage drivers shouted nothing, but quietly grit their teeth and murmured to one another. There were two of them, in an angry fashion. Gerald did not care. They could come back and beat him. He would kill both of them. They were both foot soldiers who had not seen yet even half of a battle. More than likely he had seen it all. All of the carnage one could wish to see in one's life, and he was yet blood-sickened. He laughed heartily at the thought. Perhaps they would be so stupid, he thought to himself quietly now. Perhaps they would give him the opportunity. With a sigh, he again remembered that he would have plenty of opportunity in the arena for such things. And with the men, he again bellowed, "What are we going to do, boys?" "We're going to win." Some of the men nodded and spoke in grunts of agreement. "We're going to kill every bastard in that damn arena until each one of us," Gerald nearly shouted, "until each one of us is free." The others nodded and shouted, "Yep, yeah." In a few moments, they were at their destination, and surely enough, it was a fighter's school. In fact, in his shouting, he hadn't noticed, but the streets and the alleys had led him there. Here to this fighter's school, familiar to Gerald's eye, to his unfortunate dismay. Gerald sighed. "Fantastic." "What is it?" Froshin asked. "You know this place?" Gerald nodded. "I knew all of it." "And what of it?" the boy with the red blonde hair asked. Gerald had forgotten he and the other one who were there for a moment, but he supposed that of course they would listen in to what he said. He wished for a moment that they weren't there, as some of the others did, yet there was so much death around them he did not flinch much at a couple of guardsmen dying, though they had been his brothers. These were desperate times, and besides they weren't anyone that he particularly cared for anyhow. If they had been, perhaps he would feel differently. He supposed he would clarify the situation for them, for these two boys. "Did you boys kill our guardsmen?" he asked in turn. "No," said the quieter one, who had brown hair. "We didn't." Gerald said as the horses came to a halting stop. "We shall see." As the carriage drivers came around to the back of the carriage to open the door, Gerald ended his sentence. whilst the boy with red and blonde hair spoke quietly. "We did not, sir," he said with some conviction, and Gerald nodded. He would find the answer soon enough, but for now they had to move. "Get out," said the horse drivers, clad in armor. One of them had his sword drawn. "And if I don't?" Gerald jested. "Then you die." Gerald shrugged, looking at the men, who laughed. "Of course, sire." He got up to get out of the carriage, and as soon as he had his back turned to the man with the scythe, he was struck with the blunt side of it. Gerald fell to his knees. "That ought to teach you," said the foot soldier. Gerald only laughed. "One more time, sire. I don't think that I got the message." The man kicked him, and Gerald rolled onto his back, but he did not fight back. He would not die so stupidly, bound with without a sword in his hand. He only smiled. "Sorry, sire," he said. "I'm not your sire," said the foot soldier angrily. "No," said Gerald, slowly standing up. "You're not." The foot soldier spat on him, and Gerald again slowly wiped it off and flicked it onto the ground, where he too spat. Some blood mixed in with the saliva from a cut he'd earned on his lip, which he'd garnished as he fell. The other men had slowly gotten out of the cart, and none of them were stupid enough to intervene. Gerald was glad, and as he had not wanted to help anyway. He'd had no need of it, though he could tell that at least one of the boys, the stowaways, had wanted to help. Gerald liked him. He had some vigor, and perhaps even some valor. It wouldn't matter, however, he thought, or perhaps it was. Perhaps it would matter. He would have to fight, and Gerald almost wickedly grinned at the thought. "Perhaps you will win," he called to the boy quietly. "Perhaps I'm wrong." "Get up, you madman," said the other foot soldier, who had his sword sheathed, begrudgingly grabbing hold of Gerald's arm. Despite his tone, Gerald could tell that the man didn't hate him, though the other did see him as a deserter. At least that's the story that was woven, surely, so Gerald would have thought of the Legion and of himself. It nearly brought a tear to his eye to see the sorry state of the Legion. All the men dead, the men still living, now fighters or slaves. The commander murdered out in the open as he was, but Gerald was yet hopeful, and he looked at the boy with the red blonde hair and knew that surely his family was also waiting above, in the Skylands above. As he stood, a few tears wet his face, which he wiped away slowly as his hands began to shake. Gerald Froshin nodded to him. Gerald nodded back. The two guards took note of this, and for a moment they said nothing, but remembering their orders, they grabbed hold of Gerald, commanded the men to follow, and marched each one of them, quickly despite their chains, into the fighter's school. Gerald fell and dragged a few times as they took him in, but he looked up and continued to do so at the sky, and then at the fighter's school when the sky was no longer visible. This was Ripper's school. Gerald's very potent sense of dread could not be explained. Ripper was his enemy.